Can everybody see that, the presentation?
Yes, Mary.
Father, can you see it?
I don't see the presentation. No, I do not.
You don't. All right, let's make sure. Let's see, share the screen.
This is being recorded, just so you know.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Dimitri, you're supposed to be muted.
Okay, well, he's got the power to override. So, so what I'll be talking about tonight is a little bit of an overview of COVID-19 and then some updates that I think are important as we move into a new phase, both of the pandemic, but also our response to the pandemic. And again, for those who may not have been on the call last time, I wanted to go over a little bit about the distinction between the virus that causes COVID-19 and the disease itself. And so, as you can see, that circular object that says SARS-CoV-2 virus that has spikes coming out of it is a representation of the virus itself. And the virus is SARS-CoV-2. That stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And the reason why it's called SARS-CoV-2 is another coronavirus that, my slides are moving without me cueing them. Interesting. I will override that. So the reason it is called SARS-CoV-2 is there was another coronavirus, SARS, that was discovered in 2002, 2003, that also caused an acute respiratory syndrome. That virus spread across the world just like this one, but it burned out very quickly and never got to the numbers we saw with this virus. This virus binds to our cells, and it binds to our cells through a receptor called the ACE2 receptor, and you can see that in this cartoon that I have here. And that allows the virus to get inside cells. And the whole purpose of that virus, once it gets inside, is to replicate itself. And it injures, damages, and in many cases kills those cells. And our immune response to that cell destruction and the destruction of the cells within important organs is what leads to the disease that we call COVID-19. And COVID-19 stands for coronavirus infectious disease, and 19 is for the year it was discovered, 2019. And so SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, COVID-19 is the disease. And if you look at this next panel, on the left-hand side of your screen are actual electron micrographs of SARS-CoV-2 viral particles. And you can see those little spikes or nubbins coming off the surface. And that's why this is called a coronavirus, because if you look at it, it almost looks like a crown, you know, maybe even a crown of thorns, if you're going to use analogies. It is a crown, and corona essentially translated means crown. So that's why crown virus. If you look at this other cartoon that I have here, this is a blow up of that spike protein, those thorns on the crown sticking out. And this is the protein that's critically important for the virus to enter cells. It actually binds to those ACE2 receptors expressed on our cells. But this is also the important protein that the vaccines that have been developed against. So those vaccines can allow your body to make antibodies to block the ability of the virus to bind to the receptor. So the idea of giving you those vaccines is to create a response, an antibody response, to prevent the virus from ever getting into the cells and causing the disease. And if the virus can't get into cells, it can't replicate. And if it doesn't replicate, your immune system will eliminate it. And so that's the key to vaccine. It's also the key to another therapeutic I'll talk about in a little bit called antibody therapy. And that's a very exciting new therapeutic that has been developed. It received emergency use authorization this past week. And I think it's a key tool or weapon in our battle against COVID-19. So this slide just goes through what happens when someone develops the disease, COVID-19, from a SARS-CoV-2 infection. The most common symptom is fever, followed by cough, fatigue, anorexia, shortness of breath, and body aches or myalgias. And this is not uncommon symptom presentation seen with flu that we see every year. And it's one of the things that's real important as we're in flu season now, is distinguishing between COVID-19 and the flu, because obviously the way we go about treating those two diseases is very different. There are some unique symptoms, though, that come across with SARS-CoV-2, and one of those is the loss of taste and smell. In fact, if you develop an upper respiratory tract infection with fever and you lose taste and smell, that is very suggestive that what you have is COVID-19 as opposed to the standard flu. So there are a variety of medical conditions that can make COVID-19 more severe. And I think a lot of people have heard about so-called comorbidities, and that the disease seems to be worse in people with comorbidities. And so some of these other conditions are things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD, kidney disease, anything that results in immunosuppression. Some autoimmune diseases do that. Obesity, heart disease, sickle cell diabetes, asthma, hypertension, all of these conditions can make a case of COVID-19 more severe in an individual patient. So that's comorbidities that could make COVID-19 worse. But what does COVID-19 do to comorbidities? And one of the things that we've recognized, and this isn't necessarily worsening cancer in a patient with cancer, but rather preventing patients from getting the screening they need to diagnose cancers earlier, that allows us to be more effective at treating them. And one of the concerns we have is because patients were concerned and afraid to come to the doctor during this pandemic, we're worried that routine cancer screening like mammography and colonoscopy and CT scans of the chest that look for breast cancer, colon cancer, or lung cancer, folks may not be keeping those appointments for fear of going into doctors' offices. And one of the worries is over the next 10 years, we could see an increase in 10,000 excess deaths due to cancer because of our inability to diagnose it early, as we would have normally through routine screening. And so that's something we're taking very seriously at cancer centers around the country. My cancer center has made it a major effort to make certain that we're taking precautions at the cancer center so patients don't have to fear coming in for either routine screening workup or treatment of their cancer. We screen every staff and faculty member as well as every patient when they come into the cancer center. Their temperature is checked. We do symptom checks on them. We even call patients the night before their appointments to make sure that they don't have any symptoms of COVID. It may be a little difficult to see, but in the upper right-hand corner, we have plexiglass around every station. So this blocks the potential exposure to droplets or exhaled particles. Our cleaning staff is constantly sweeping through the building, cleaning touch surfaces to decrease the risk of transmission of the virus. And in our waiting rooms, we have separated chairs so they're at least 6 feet apart. And we've limited the number of folks that a patient can bring with them to try to maintain social distancing and decrease crowds indoors during the pandemic. The single most important thing, though, that all of us can do, and we certainly do this in my cancer center, and I'm fastidious about it. Actually, I have one sitting next to me right here. The single most important thing any of us can do is mask wearing. It's more important than the actual physical distancing and hand washing, although those are critically important as well, because we've learned through a number of studies that have been conducted to date that mask wearing not only protects those around us from the droplets that we exhale that carry the virus, but it actually protects the individual wearing the mask from getting enough of a viral load to make them symptomatic or carriers to be able to pass the infection on. And we didn't know that early on in the pandemic. We thought mask wearing was mainly helpful to prevent the spread of the virus to others, but we know now that it actually protects the wearer of the mask as well. And folks often ask me, when should I wear masks? Do I have to wear a mask in my car? Do I have to wear a mask in my house? So my answer is, if you're in the car by yourself, or you're in the car with someone who you are essentially living with on a daily basis and you're effectively quarantined with, then the short answer is no, you don't need to be wearing a mask. But if you're with any others that you don't live with, or if the person you live with goes out to work every day and is with other people, it is a good idea to wear a mask in the house around those folks. And certainly if you're indoors around other people that you don't live with, you should always be wearing a mask. And I've had people say, well, can I take the mask off when I have to talk or when I sing, etc.? And that's the very time when you most need to have the mask on, because that's when you're exhaling droplets and particles that can carry the virus. And so when you put the mask on, keep the mask on as long as there are others around you. If you go to work and you work in a private office, or you work in a cubicle that's protected by plexiglass around it, etc., and you don't have many other, if any other people in the room, occasionally taking the mask off is not a bad, thing to do. But again, if you're around people, you should have your mask on, especially when you're indoors. Social distancing is also critically important, but indoors, social distancing isn't going to help unless we're wearing masks. And the reason is we know that the concentration of particles can linger in the air and be circulated in the air. And so mask wearing is of critical import. I can't overstate that, although I try to overstate it. Mask wearing is absolutely critical. And as I mentioned, there have been some studies done that have been excellent in terms of showing that even cloth masks, even homemade cotton face masks, can prevent the amount of particles that are exhaled and therefore decrease the risk of exposing others. And the weave of cotton in those masks actually captures particles to prevent you from inhaling them. And this is why it's important when you don and doff your mask. Don is when you put your mask on. Doffing is when you take your mask off. And the way that I do it is, since I often wear these masks with these ear loops, is I always touch the mask or manipulate the mask by the ear loops. So when I'm putting the mask on, it goes on with me touching the ear loops. When I'm taking the mask off, I first wash my hands, or I wipe my hands down with alcohol, and then I take the mask off by the ear loops. The reason is this mask, if it's working properly, is it's catching droplets on its surface. And so you don't want to be touching the front of the mask or adjusting the mask with your hands if you can help it, because then you get those droplets on your hands. If you find yourself touching your mask, alcohol swab your hands, because that will decrease the chance that you're passing any particles to your hands. Cloth masks should be washed. The paper masks, these sort of K95 masks, should be thrown away and you can use a new one. What I do, because I'm wearing masks all the time, is I have one of those ultraviolet boxes that clean your iPhone. They're available online. There's a number of different vendors that make them. And that UV box can be used to sterilize your mask, whether it's a KN95 or a cloth mask. So if you're gonna wanna wear it for a couple of days before you wash it, UV light is a good way to kill any of the virus that's on the surface of the mask.
Is that on Amazon, Doc?
Yeah, it's on Amazon.
You recommend any particular one?
Mary, what's the model that we have? I know you're sitting in the kitchen and it's sitting on the counter in the kitchen. Mary can
Casetify.
Casetify. So CASTIFY is the model that we have, and that we use all the time to sterilize our phones and to sterilize our masks. And that UV light works very effectively. I'll answer a lot of questions during the Q&A on masks if folks have more questions on masks. Another real important thing we did at our cancer center was to better understand the risk of surface contamination, again, to determine how we can keep our patients and visitors as safe as possible. And my radiation oncology team, led by my colleague, Bruce Hafty, conducted a study where they took viral swabs of surfaces, chairs, doorknobs, doors, the machines where they deliver their radiation therapy. We did this in our infusion and waiting room areas too. And because of our cleaning regimen, we found no evidence of infectious particles on any of those surfaces. And I think almost every doctor's office is following the CDC guidelines for this frequent cleaning. And so I think this should assuage concerns that folks might have about going in to see the doctor for any chronic conditions they may have or screening procedures that they need. The doctor's offices are, by and large, safe zones from exposure to COVID. Emergency rooms may be a little bit more risky just because of the number of patients going into the ER. And unless you're ill, I would avoid using the emergency room as a clinic to go into. I would feel safer going to an urgent care center or a doctor's office. If you do need to go to an emergency room, though, don't hesitate to go. Wear a mask and make sure you're sanitizing your hands. And they'll be taking all sorts of precautions in the emergency room as well. So a little bit about testing, and people often ask me questions about testing and how important is it to get tested and how is testing performed and what are the different types of testing that are done. And so in the US, and this was data as of mid-September, we've been testing far more people now than we were back in the spring of 2020. March, April, and May, we were only testing very symptomatic folks, and we had very limited testing capability. Now our testing regimen allows us to do a lot more testing nationwide, and certainly in the New York and New Jersey area, there's a lot of capability for testing. The most common test that's done is the so-called PCR-based test, and PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. This is a test that looks for DNA, essentially, the nucleic acids that are the building blocks of life. And so we're actually testing for genes in the virus that are unique and different from genes that we carry normally. And that's how we can distinguish that the virus is present. Because it's looking at DNA, this test is highly sensitive. In fact, probably in some cases too sensitive, as it will pick up the virus, whether or not that virus is still infectious or not. And when you hear about people testing positive for SARS-CoV-2 weeks or even a month after they've been ill, it's because these tests are so sensitive at picking up viral DNA. And so a positive test doesn't mean absolutely that you're infectious, but we have to assume you're infectious if the test is positive, unless we know you were symptomatic and you're at least 14 days away from your last symptom and at least 3 to 5 days away from your last fever. But PCR testing is the most widely used testing. There's different ways we get the samples. You can either have that, what feels like a brain biopsy test, where they put that long cotton swab up your nose. That's called a nasopharyngeal sample. PCR is done on those. It could be an anterior nasal chamber sample, where they just put the swab up into your opening and maybe midway into your nose, not all the way back to the back of your throat. That also is done for PCR testing. Or you may give a saliva sample, where you spit into a tube and the tube is then sent off. All of those are PCR-based tests. It's just different ways of getting the sample. There's also something called antibody testing, where they take a sample of blood and they look to see if you've developed antibodies against the virus. That lets us know that you have been infected. You might still be in the early stages of the infection, that you could be infectious with an antibody test, but the only way to know that would be to do a PCR test at the same time to see if there's virus present, because the antibodies will linger for a time after the virus. Early on in the pandemic, we had hoped that if you got exposed to the virus and developed antibodies, it would mean that you couldn't be infected again, and you couldn't be infected in a way that you would get ill or that you would pass the virus on. And we even talked about things like serology passports or antibody passports, where if we tested you and your antibodies were positive, we could let you go out and about, go back to work, go to the front lines as a healthcare worker, because the thinking was that you would not be able to be infected again. Unfortunately, this virus was less like the chickenpox virus, where once you're infected, you're pretty much immune for life, and more like a flu virus and other coronaviruses, where the immunity to an exposure is relatively short-lived. In fact, we only believe folks are truly immune to the virus after an initial exposure for about 4 to 6 months. And so that goal of an antibody passport was not to be. However, we believe the vaccines, when you get vaccinated with the vaccines, will deliver an immunity for at least 12 to 18 months. And so it's likely that folks will get vaccinated once a year. But the immunity from the vaccine is far more robust than the immunity from being exposed to the virus. And so the way we're going to get to so-called herd immunity, that is, enough people have antibodies against the virus that they can't be infected and they won't pass those infections on to others, is going to be through vaccination. And that really is the way of thinking now. Another type of test, I'll just mention it quickly because it's out there, is an antigen test. These tests can be done much more easily than the PCR test, and they give their answers much more quickly. These are the so-called rapid tests that'll give you an answer in 15 minutes. They're actually testing for presence of the virus protein, that the virus particle is actually there. So these tests are much better at predicting who's infectious. If an antigen test is positive, it's more likely that someone's in the early phase of the infection and therefore at risk of being infectious. The problem with the antigen tests is their false negative rate is a little higher than the PCR-based test. We are using this test in my cancer center. I'm actually comparing the antigen test to the PCR test. Every patient that comes in that's going to be started on cancer therapy gets tested by PCR and antigen test. And so my hope is that the antigen test will be good enough for us to make decisions about treatment and who's infected and who's not, because the results come back faster and it's easier to perform and a little less expensive. So that's testing. And again, I'll be happy to answer any questions about testing when we get to the Q&A. So I thought it would be important to show where we're at now in terms of infections. This is US statistics. This is worldwide statistics. So this is across the entire world. 191 countries and regions have tested positive for presence of the virus. Currently worldwide, there are 53,600,000 roughly cases. This is data as of yesterday, and 1.3 million deaths worldwide. If you look at the US, which is our next slide, this is a number of positive cases in the United States and deaths in the US, 10,700,000 cases, 244,000 deaths. And these two curves I show below are daily case numbers. So each one of these vertical bars represents a day, and this horizontal line shows you from mid-March through yesterday. And what this shows, as you can see, is we had this uptick of cases in the spring, March through May. It never really came down as low as we wanted to US-wide. You hear Dr. Fauci talk about this all the time. So over the summer, we saw a surge, mostly in the South, Southwest, and West. That never really came down to levels we wanted to drive it down. And now you can see we've entered the winter surge. And that's an even higher surge than we saw either over the summer or in last spring. And this is mainly because we're not adhering to wearing masks religiously, washing our hands, and trying not to be in crowded places indoors. The graph below shows daily death rates, which we saw went down in the summertime, came back up a little bit, and now are coming up again. They're not nearly as high as they were during March, April, and May. And I think that's a tribute to two things. One, we know a lot more about this disease and we have better ways of treating it now so we can make it less lethal. And also we're testing far more patients now than we were back in the spring. And so we're seeing, when you look at these peaks of daily virus counts, that's accounted for in part by asymptomatic testing, which we weren't doing back in the spring. Next, I want to show you the data in New York. And New York, compared to the other states in the US, has done a much better job at handling the virus than we have seen in other states. If you look at how we really brought that curve down during the summer months, that was critical. If we hadn't done that, we'd be in a much worse situation now than we are. You can see that daily case numbers are going up in New York, and this is because we're inside again. School is open, restaurants have opened, even with limited capacity. And that's why it's so critical that as we get into the colder months, we're wearing masks and we're trying to avoid indoor spaces unless it's necessary. But you can see the daily death curve, which was horrible in March, April, and May, we have really kept under control in New York because we're adhering to these practices and we haven't overwhelmed our hospital system. And that's why it's incumbent on all of us to be fastidious about our mask wearing and our hand washing and our avoiding crowded indoor spaces, because that's what's keeping this day over day number of deaths as low as it's been in New York since the end of May. Not every state can claim that benefit. And so that's real critical for us. Just because a lot has been made about age of infection and hospitalization and then socioeconomic or racial and ethnic differences, I just wanted to show this information very quickly. Early on in the pandemic, we were mostly seeing hospitalizations of folks over the age of 60 or 65. And if you look at this graphic, the red bars are folks over 65. The dark blue bars are folks between 50 and 64. And then those teal kind of bluish color are 18 to 49. And you can see early on in the pandemic, and this is US-wide, nationwide, it was mostly folks over the age of 50. Now, if you look at September, and this is true into October and November, it's an almost equal age distribution. We are seeing younger people get hospitalized now with this infection because it's become more widespread throughout the community. And so this is not a disease that only afflicts the elderly and folks with comorbidities. Young, otherwise healthy people can get sick, and some of them require hospitalization. And so it's why we have to be so careful about mask wearing, hand washing, avoiding crowds indoors, etc. I sound like a broken record, but it's the major tool we have to stay safe and get to the end of this pandemic. This just shows something that I think is very important. I know at Church of Our Saviour, we are very focused on folks of various ethnicities. Health disparities, economic disparities are of critical import to us. And we have seen a disproportionate number of Hispanics and folks of African-American descent and Caribbean Black descent have worse cases of COVID requiring hospitalization. This shows hospitalizations. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be focusing on our ministries that are geared towards those that have challenges, because they are really bearing a large brunt of the hospitalizations of this illness. So I promised, Father, and it is absolutely true, that we have reason to be optimistic as we are entering a challenging time with respect to viral case numbers. And that is, we have developed treatments over the course of this pandemic that are effective at treating COVID-19. And I've listed here a bunch of treatments that have been effective and one treatment that's gotten a lot of press, but didn't turn out to be all that effective. Remdesivir actually turned out to be useful in this disease. It was originally developed for Ebola and other viral infections, Zika virus, but it turned out to have some activity against SARS-CoV-2. And remdesivir is the first agent to be FDA approved for the treatment of SARS-CoV-2. And it can help shorten the time of hospitalization and help decrease the number of folks that actually require assistive ventilation or ventilators. Dexamethasone has been found to be extremely useful for those folks requiring ventilation on an artificial ventilator. In fact, it is the main treatment we've seen that lowers mortality for folks that require ventilation. And a lot of those low curves we've seen in New York, especially for daily deaths, is due to the fact that we now know how to treat this disease far better, and we have some of these treatments that we can deploy. A lot of you may have heard about convalescent plasma. That's taking samples from a patient who was infected and isolating their plasma, which will carry antibodies, and then administer those antibodies to try to block the virus from entering cells, replicating, and causing the disease. That has been shown to be effective. Unfortunately, all of the randomized trials conducted with hydroxychloroquine, including one I conducted at Rutgers, have failed to show any efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. And so we've really abandoned that as an approach. The single most exciting therapy, though, to me, of all those on this list, is monoclonal antibody therapy. And these are antibodies that have been developed in the laboratory against that spike protein that makes the crown around the virus that I talked about earlier. You may have heard these in the lay press. Regeneron makes this antibody. That's the version the president got when he was infected and became symptomatic. Eli Lilly makes a version of this antibody. That's the antibody that former Governor Chris Christie got when he was admitted to the hospital. He has severe asthma, and I am convinced would have required intubation if he didn't receive the antibody therapy. Eli Lilly's antibody received emergency use authorization this week, and our strategy now at healthcare facilities is not to wait for patients to become symptomatic, but if we test someone and they're positive for the virus, we're hopefully going to be able to deploy the antibody then to try to prevent them from becoming symptomatic. And certainly folks with early symptoms before they've required hospitalization would be candidates for this antibody therapy, which I think will be very effective. We also tried various means of trying to reduce part of your immune response to this virus. Your body makes so-called cytokines, which are proteins that help your immune system eliminate the virus, but they also can cause severe toxicity. That is, your body's own cytokines can make it difficult for you to breathe. It can increase risk of clotting, etc. We tried various strategies to prevent those cytokines from causing those side effects, but the results were mixed. And so bottom line, I think on this list, remdesivir, dexamethasone, and the monoclonal antibodies are really our mainstay weapons against this virus and COVID-19, and are what is enabling us to have better outcomes for patients. But the main thing, the exit ramp, the off-ramp from this pandemic is vaccines. And I've put that as the final bullet. And I'll end with a quick update on where are we with vaccines against SARS-CoV-2. And I have to say, and I shared this with Father, that the fact that we have a vaccine, this is the Pfizer vaccine, that has been shown to be greater than 90% effective and was developed in less than 9 months, is nothing short of a miracle. I think we as a population worldwide are going to look back on this pandemic 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and look at how quickly an effective vaccine was produced, and think of it like we think of penicillin being developed for bacterial infections or sanitation, and how that changed infectious diseases like cholera and dysentery in the modern world. That's how amazing and unprecedented the development of this vaccine was. The fastest we've ever seen a vaccine developed prior to this was about 6 to 8 years. And so developing a vaccine that's effective, and hopefully the safety data that we'll hear about in the next couple of weeks will be as exciting, that it's safe, will be an unprecedented milestone. The vaccine is unique in that this is the first time we've ever developed a vaccine using messenger RNA, mRNA. And what mRNA is it's the blueprint, the instructions for making proteins that your genes print out during the normal course of your cells functioning. And what an mRNA vaccine does is it gives your cells, your own body, the blueprint for making that spike protein, not the virus, just the spike protein. And it makes it in a way that you develop a robust antibody response against that protein that your own body has made. It's revolutionary. We can essentially, if we know the antigen or protein on the surface of a virus that we can make an antibody against and block, we can sequence that, print out the blueprint, make it into this message that we inject into your body, and your body will then make the protein that you can make your antibodies against. It's revolutionary in that we don't have to actually inject either live virus or attenuated virus, which is how most vaccines were developed in the past, or use a different version of that virus. For those of you that are as old as I am, that have scars on your arm for smallpox, you were given a cowpox injection to make you produce antibodies against smallpox. It was the actual virus. It's why you developed a scab and a scar at that location. Now we just give the blueprint and we can make a vaccine and an antibody. The folks that develop this will likely get the Nobel Prize, I have no doubt, because of that single discovery and how it impacted our ability to treat this pandemic. So remember, I predicted it here when I said that.
I want to just stress the importance of the miraculous part, Dr. Stephen.
Yes.
In other words, perspective, right? So this would normally have taken years, right? Rather than months.
Yep.
You said something about 6 years, and it would be
6 to 8 years at best. And we did this in
40%.
That's right. That's a good point. Most of the vaccines we've developed, there's a couple of exceptions. Measles vaccine is a highly effective vaccine. Measles vaccine is more than 95% effective. But most of the vaccines we've developed in the history of vaccines, and certainly the flu vaccines that you get every year, hopefully everybody should get their flu shots. If you haven't gotten one, please get your flu shot. They're at best 60% effective. In an average flu season, they're about 40% effective. Here we're talking about a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that's greater than 90% effective. We have never made a vaccine against a coronavirus anywhere in the world, and here you have the first try is 90% effective. Tomorrow, we are going to find out how effective the Moderna mRNA vaccine is. That result is going to be released, and I predict it'll be as effective as the Pfizer because it uses the same platform. Moderna is submitting their data or has submitted their data for safety evaluation. And so I believe the Pfizer vaccine will get its emergency use authorization shortly after Thanksgiving, and we may get the Moderna with emergency use authorization as a Christmas present. And then the final vaccine, and importantly, with both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, initially, you're going to need to get 2 injections, a first injection and then an injection either 21 days later if it's the Pfizer vaccine or 28 days later if it's the Moderna vaccine. And then once a year, you'll get a single booster injection. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which will probably come available in February or March, is a single vaccine injection, and it uses a slightly different spin on the same theme. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a virus in and of itself, not one that can replicate, not one that causes illness, but it carries that blueprint that we talked about with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, and is probably more efficient at getting your cells to make the spike protein from that blueprint to immunize you. And so I think slow and steady will probably win the race. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, given that it's only one injection and that it will make an even more robust immune response, I think will ultimately be the vaccine that gets dispersed worldwide. But Pfizer and Moderna are really the Marines landing on the beach for us that are going to start to get us towards ending this pandemic. And those vaccines will come available for injection into patients shortly after Thanksgiving. They'll initially be given to frontline healthcare workers, the elderly, and folks with significant comorbidity. But by March or April, I believe we'll have at least 3 vaccines, the ones listed here, probably a 4th from AstraZeneca, and they'll be administered worldwide to everyone, not just folks that are healthcare workers, elderly, or sick. So that's where we are on the vaccines. And so I want to end this with what I'm terming Fauci's 4 fundamentals. And Tony Fauci, who really, in my opinion, is a hero of this pandemic, with the clear speaking of the truth, the way to convey important concepts in a way that folks can understand it, having the fortitude and bravery to stand up amongst others around him who may have been trying to tamp down his message, and still finding a way to get that message out. I've known Tony for 25 years. He is one of the smartest, most honorable people I've ever had the privilege to work with. He is passionate about preventing infectious diseases. He was one of the leaders that brought the AIDS pandemic under control in the 80s and early 90s. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom as a result of his efforts, the highest award given to a civilian in the United States. And so what Fauci's 4 fundamentals are: wear a mask. Again, I've said it over and over. It's so simple, and it's our strongest tool right now for preventing spread of this disease and those spikes that we see happening day over day on the news. More cases, more cases. If everyone wore a mask all the time when they were out of their house, I guarantee you within weeks, we'd see those numbers come down. Social distancing, that's 6 to 8 feet. Try not to be within somebody's personal space because that increases the risk. Handshaking is a bygone era. If you feel it's necessary to convey your appreciation for something that someone's doing, a salute, or if you have to, an elbow bump is not as bad as a handshake. Stay outdoors more than indoors. I know that's tough for us in the Northeast, especially as we enter the wintertime. It's going to be cold, but if you need to be indoors, wear a mask, stay 6 to 8 feet apart. If you don't have to be indoors, try not to be indoors, and then avoid crowds. If you are indoors, try to keep the numbers of folks in that space as small as you can. This is a tough period of time. I don't think any of us understate that. We've been asked as a generation to face a challenge here on behalf of all of us. Each of us is who keeps each other safe through this. And it sucks, quite frankly, pardon my language. We can't all be together in church on Sundays and share that fellowship we have with each other. I know there are holidays coming up, Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc., and I can address some recommendations around that during the Q&A. It really is a terrible period of time. We are social beings and we like to be in each other's company. But if we can stay strong and double down on our efforts through the winter, I can assure you, given the fact that the vaccines are available now, and we know that during the summer months, these infection rates go down because we're outdoors, that this coming winter is the worst of it. Once we get through this winter, the light is at the end of the tunnel. And I think by this time next year, we'll be in a period of normalcy that will be much less looking like the pandemic and much more looking like a pre-pandemic period of time. And so that's my soapbox. I'm happy to answer questions. I give here just a couple of links. Again, my acknowledgement and tip of the hat to my friend and colleague, Anthony Fauci, who I think is just a superhero through all of this. The Johns Hopkins website is where you can get the day-by-day data on numbers of infections, deaths, and then the CDC website is jam-packed with important information about how to mitigate spread of the virus and what therapies have come online. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions. That picture is my cancer center in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So thanks, Father.
Okay, so just a quick question for me. Does wearing a mask compromise your immunity?
No.
Okay, now next question. From the chat room, if we get the Pfizer vaccine this year, does each subsequent booster have to be the same?
So that's a great question. I think it's important when you get the vaccine this year that you stick with the same vaccine if you need 2 injections. So if you get an initial injection with the Pfizer vaccine, the second injection needs to be the Pfizer vaccine. If you get an initial injection with the Moderna vaccine, the second injection needs to be with the Moderna vaccine. What we don't know yet is if boosters can be interchangeable. If you've gotten the Pfizer vaccine, but next year the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is more readily available, do you have to wait for the Pfizer vaccine or can you go to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. I don't want to be held to this because, again, I have no data. This is just my opinion. I think that for booster injections, they will probably be interchangeable, that you'll probably be able to get a different effective vaccine, that is an FDA-approved vaccine by that point. You'll probably be able to mix and match on a year-to-year basis, but the initial vaccination, you should stick to the vaccine that you got the first injection with.
Okay, okay, Joanne, if that doesn't answer your question, then type up a clarification question. It's the question from Stephanie. Do you recommend the vaccine for children or teens?
So the trials of vaccines in the under 18 and under 12 age group have not been completed yet. And so we have no efficacy and safety data for children yet. And because this disease, COVID-19, appears to affect folks in much larger numbers over the age of 18 and is spread more from folks over the age of 18 because they tend to have higher viral loads than children do. Children can be a source of spread, but they don't appear to be super spreaders like we see with adults. The initial vaccines I just mentioned, the Pfizer vaccine, which I hope will have emergency use authorization by the end of this month, the Moderna vaccine, which I hope will follow shortly thereafter, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in January, February, will all be for 18 years of age and older. Again, my hope, though, is that the trials that are giving the vaccines to children, which are ongoing, will be able to report out their results over the next several months, and we'll see vaccinations for children shortly after the vaccines are deployed in adults. They're much more fastidious with safety data in children for obvious reasons. Pediatric population, they're still developing, et cetera. And so that's what's taking a little bit longer. But these vaccines that are rolling out first will be for adults.
Okay, if all goes well, if all goes on schedule, when do you predict we will achieve herd immunity?
So the going thoughts right now, or the prevailing thoughts right now on what percentage of the population will need to be immune from this coronavirus for us to truly see herd immunity.
What's herd immunity?
Okay, so herd immunity is enough people have become immune to the pathogen. Viruses most often are thought about with herd immunity, that the virus can't find enough hosts to infect to be able to successfully replicate and be passed on to someone else. They can't find a safe haven. If enough people become immune, the virus burns out or goes to a very low level because it just can't find susceptible hosts to multiply in, because your immune system fights it off before you can spread it to someone else. That's herd immunity. And so the question of what percentage of a population needs to become immune to reach herd immunity, varies from virus to virus, and it depends on how infectious the virus is, how much of a reservoir you can be if you're asymptomatic, etc. We believe with SARS-CoV-2 that we have to hit about 65 to 70% of the population immune before we'll hit herd immunity, which is why it's so important for people to get vaccinated. You can get immunity by being exposed to the virus. The reason why you don't want to get to herd immunity by being exposed to the virus is twofold. One, if you got 65% of our population exposed to the virus, which would be hundreds of millions of people, with an overall 2% case positive mortality, you'd have 1 million, 2 million people dying of the disease, 3 million people dying of the disease. That's unacceptable. The other problem is that we know if you become immune due to being exposed to the virus, that immunity probably only lasts 4 to 6 months. And so we'll never get to that 65% because folks that were exposed to the virus 6 months later are no longer immune. They'll continuously lower that 65% that will never truly reach it. It's like having a big bucket and you keep emptying the water as it enters your boat from the hole in the boat. If you're emptying the water fast enough, the boat will never sink. If you keep losing the immune status, you'll never hit herd immunity. The best way to do it is with a vaccine, because we know you'll be immune for 12 to 18 months, and we can vaccinate you again every year. This is going to be an important vaccination for us as humankind. It's going to be like vaccinating against smallpox was. It's going to be like vaccinating against polio was. This is going to be critical that kids are vaccinated at an early age, and the adult population gets a yearly vaccine against this pathogen.
Okay.
Yep, you went mute, Father.
We have a number of questions. We have to get through them. Those of you who just joined or recently joined, you can type your question in the chat room and I will read it aloud. Thank you, Dr. Libutti. My cousin is a registered nurse. Caught it months ago. She gets beaten and back at work. Could she be contagious again without knowing it?
So we don't know. I mean, the short answer is we don't know. We know that folks can be infected a second time with the virus and develop symptoms. It all depends on how much virus they were infected with the first time and how much of an antibody response they developed. We believe it's possible that somebody getting infected a second time could, in fact, be contagious and spread the virus. And so it's for that reason that even if someone's been infected, we still recommend that when they're out and about, not with family members they're living with, but they're out and about, that they wear masks. Having been infected is not a passport away from having to wear a mask.
Okay, you can all read Dooley Zimmer's comment about a local update. What are your recommendations for or against extended family gathering dinners? And if you can remove the slide and put it back to the thing.
Yeah, let me do that.
What are your recommendations for or against family gatherings or dinners?
Okay, so I get asked this question all the time. This is probably the most frequent question I'm getting asked now. I was actually interviewed by a publication called The Cancer Letter, which is a big publication in my field. And this is one of the questions they asked me without preparing me for it. They basically said, Dr. Libutti, what are you going to do for Thanksgiving, with your family, and what do you recommend? And so I have to be careful here because everybody has to make their own decisions and everybody's got a certain level of risk tolerance, etc. My own advice and what I am doing myself is next to Easter and Holy Week, Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday of the year. I love Thanksgiving. It's when my family members from around the country that I don't get to see day to day come to our house in West Harrison. Mary makes a killer Thanksgiving meal. I mean, she's the amazing cook anyway, but her Thanksgiving dinners are legendary. I usually cook the turkey on our barbecue out back, a recipe I found 6 or 8 years ago. We make an amazing, juicy turkey. It's incredible. I know your mouths are watering right now hearing about it. Thanksgiving's my favorite holiday, and we usually have the house packed with relatives, etc. This year, there will be 6 of us at Thanksgiving. My nuclear family, Mary, myself, and our 3 kids, Each of my kids, by the way, is getting tested before they come home, into that nuclear family. And my mom, who we are going to go after we've all been tested and pick up, she's 81, lives by herself on Long Island, and we're going to bring her to our house for Thanksgiving. We're going to Zoom Thanksgiving with our other family members around the country. I believe that we should strive, if at all possible, not to have more than 10 people in your home for the holidays. If you can keep your home to 10 or fewer, and if folks who are coming to the home haven't been tested, wear masks when you can. If you can space folks out for dinner, do it buffet style, where you all may not be sitting at the same table. You're sitting in different areas when you take your mask off to eat. If you say your prayer together, as we do grace obviously at every meal. We do a special one at Thanksgiving. We go around the table asking everybody to say what they've been grateful for over the last year. If you have people that don't live with you on a day-to-day basis and they haven't been tested, no reason why you can't do that with a mask on and then go out and about and have your meals with your mask off without being on top of each other. But if you can keep the numbers to 10 or fewer through Thanksgiving, through Christmas, until we start to see that the vaccine is being more widely deployed, it's my opinion that that's the safest approach. Oh, Father, you're muted.
This one I'm going to try and announce, but if you can see the one that's posted at 5:54.
Is the AstraZeneca an mRNA vaccine? And what information can you give regarding this vaccine? Also, can you discuss recent social media rants regarding nanoparticles in vaccines? All right, so this is one I can actually answer pretty well. I've spent a large part of my scientific career developing nanoparticles for the use of treatment for disease. In fact, I conducted, and I'm saying this not as a means of tooting my own horn, but just sort of giving you comfort in what I'm going to say about nanoparticles. I conducted the first human clinical trial of a nanoparticle anti-cancer drug about 12 years ago, 13 years ago. I've given testimony to the FDA, to the NIH on safe use of nanoparticles. I can tell you, you have nothing to fear about the nanoparticles that are being used to deliver the mRNA for these vaccines. They are biodegradable agents that just make it easier to carry the mRNA and stimulate your cells to take up the mRNA to make the spike protein that your immune system responds against. These are not robots that are going to crawl around in your body. They're not heavy metals that are going to cause severe disease long-term in patients. They're not going to challenge the environment. These are safe platforms for the delivery of vaccination. So that's about nanoparticles. I believe the AstraZeneca vaccine is an mRNA-based vaccine as well. I'm not as familiar with that one. AstraZeneca's vaccine is really being developed off of the Oxford technology. It's a European vaccine program. Not that it won't be available in the States as well. The federal government has bought up doses of AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccine already. That's actually an interesting story in and of itself. I won't go into tremendous depth on it, but never before in the history of the development of a vaccine has the federal government taken the risk and subsidized the companies to make enough vaccine to vaccinate everyone before they even knew whether it would work. I mean, if the vaccine was only 20% effective, they would have been dumping stockpiles of vaccine that they've already made. This vaccine has been pre-deployed. As soon as the green light is given for the Pfizer vaccine, it's already been distributed across the country and can start to be administered. It's one of the largest logistics things that have been taken on by this country since World War II, when we turned typewriter factories into factories to make weapons, when we turned the car industries, mass production plants into turning out tanks and planes. This is the largest single effort that's ever been undertaken to be able to do that.
Okay. We hear that some asthmatics do better with this virus. Is that because of steroid meds help them?
That's a great question. We don't really understand why that's the case, but I think most of us believe that it's chronic use of steroids. And so folks that are using steroids inhibit some of the inflammatory activity that helps the virus to spread more actively, and may mitigate it in asthmatics. Now, that's not to say asthmatics can't get very sick with COVID-19. They can, and it's why some of these new therapies like antibody therapies are so important. But there are papers out there saying that folks that are on active anti-asthma treatment appear to be less at risk, and it probably is related to steroids.
What are your thoughts regarding the safety danger of airline travel?
Okay, so again, everybody has to make their own risk benefit assessment. You know, if you're needing to travel for your livelihood, like if you don't travel, you're going to lose your job, or you're needing to travel to go visit a family member who you otherwise, you know, it's going to be a severe problem. They need your help. You're helping to support their care, whatever else it is. Then take precautions when you're flying. Wear a mask through the entire flight. Hand sanitizer. I would actually recommend wearing gloves because we rely on the airline industry to be cleaning the trays, but you don't know, and you're going to be in that seat for a while. Wipe them down before you get on it. Airline is very good in that the HEPA filters they use in the air exchange, they exchange the entire air within the cockpit at a rate of something like every 6 minutes, or in the cabin at a rate of every 6 minutes. And so there's a lot of good air exchange, et cetera, but you're in an enclosed space with a number of other people. And so if you have to travel, wear a mask, wear gloves, hand sanitizer, wipe things down. Is it free of risk? No, nothing's free of risk, but that will decrease your risk. If you can avoid air travel, if you're traveling because you want to go take a vacation, if you're traveling and it's not entirely necessary, just don't do it. I haven't been on a plane since March. I'm a guy, given my job, that would travel on an airplane 4 to 6 times a month to various meetings I would have to go to, et cetera, not to mention when we would go to visit family. I haven't been on an airplane since March. And I don't intend to get on one. I can't imagine. Fortunately, I don't have a situation where I have to be on a plane for my job. I can do the things that I need to do by Zoom. And I don't, thankfully, have elderly or ill family members in other parts of the country that I have to attend to. And so for me, it's a risk I'm just not willing to take. But everybody has to make their own risk assessment.
Okay, maybe a little quicker. Thoughts on when will the vaccines be available to general population rather than to prioritized target groups?
March or April.
Okay, Antonia?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Dr. Steve. Nice job. You're my hero. Oh, that's good. With these droplets, it seems like they spread through indoor spaces the same way that incense spreads through church. What are your recommendations on ventilation?
That's a great analogy, you know, because smoke in the air sort of travels a similar way that aerosolized droplets travel. And these droplets are of various sizes. The larger droplets don't really travel very far. The smaller droplets can very much travel through the space, and masks are very effective at blocking both the large and small droplets, which is why they're so important. You know, it's going to get harder and harder to adequately ventilate indoor spaces as we get into the colder weather, because we can't just open the windows and sit there and freeze as we're hoping we're ventilating. There are, and we can go into more depth, certainly the Parish Council can discuss this, there are standing air handlers that not only have HEPA filters, but UV light within them, that you'd need a number of them in a space as big as the church, but these will turn over the air, kind of like what an airline does. Every 6 to 8 minutes, it'll have turned over all the air. They don't replace mask wearing, but they can reduce risk. And so that might be something that could be looked into. And we can look at philanthropic ways to try to support those. I was recently in my dentist's office. He has a number of these in his office, and he actually donated one to his grandchild's kindergarten. So they'd have one of these standing air handlers churning air around within the kindergarten. I think that there's good science to support the benefit of using those, and that may be something that we can look into.
Okay, Vula Sporopolis, yes, it's being recorded. I'm going to put my email in this chat room. You can email me and I can send you the link. Dr. Steve, is getting the vaccine as important? This is just my questions. Is getting the vaccine as important as wearing a mask? In other words, what would you say to those people who are scared of the vaccine?
So getting the vaccine is as important as wearing the mask. It doesn't replace wearing the mask until we know enough people have been vaccinated that we can go to a posture where mask wearing is maybe seasonal. And it's not a bad idea to wear masks during the flu season anyway, because masks will help reduce the risk of flu spread. And a lot of countries around the world, especially in Asia, have adopted that, for a long time. But it is as, if not more important, because that's our exit ramp. The way we're going to get out of this pandemic is by getting enough folks vaccinated. I will not take the vaccine unless I think it's safe, and I'm going to review the safety data when it comes available in the next couple of weeks. And I will let all of you know when I've taken the vaccine. I fully intend to take the first safe and effective vaccine that gets emergency use authorization as a healthcare provider. There are some side effects with any vaccine. Not 100% of folks don't get the side effects. It's some percentage. The vaccine is not the virus, so you're not going to get COVID-19 from the vaccine. No way, no how. But you may get some soreness on your arm where you got the injection. And some people report a mild fever, some muscle aches, a headache for 24 or 36 hours after receiving the vaccine. That is mitigated with Advil. That gets rid of most of the symptoms. And the second injection of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine is apparently much less chance of having even those mild symptoms from the vaccine. So I believe the vaccine will be safe, or it won't get emergency use authorization. I'm going to review the data myself. I think once a safe vaccine has been approved for emergency use authorization, if you're eligible to get it, get it.
Elderly concerns?
No, in fact, this vaccine was designed to be rolled out to folks over the age of 65. All of the trials were powered to make sure they had enough people over the age of 65 that were in the study. So we're going to have safety data on that age population. And in fact, folks over the age of 60 appear to have less chance of even those mild side effects than folks that are younger. The folks that are younger seem to have a slightly higher incidence of fever and body aches for 24 to 36 hours than folks over the age of 60.
And how many people took the test?
So you mean how many people were in the trial?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
So the Pfizer trial, I think, had 60,000 participants, but in order to be, and those 60,000 are all eligible for safety data. That is to determine what's the safety of the vaccine. And they look at the safety data constantly, but there are mainly two mild markers for the safety vaccine. There's a 60-day mile marker. That's the one that will allow them to get emergency use authorization. Those 60 days will be up for the last patient who received the vaccine around Thanksgiving. That's why it's going to take till then, till they can review all that data. And then there's a 6-month mile post. Once it gets to 6 months and the safety data is still in line with the 60-day, that's where it'll get actual FDA approval, not just emergency use authorization. So the safety data will be on that 30,000 to 60,000 patients that were in each of the trials that will be coming to a close. The efficacy data is on a much smaller number, because for them to determine efficacy, people have to actually get infected with the virus in the two arms of the study. The arm that got the vaccine and the arm that got something called a placebo, which is just an inert injection of like water that won't vaccinate you. And they're blinded. The patients don't know which one they got. The doctors don't know which one they gave. And then they wait to see how many people became infected in the group with the placebo and how many people became infected in the group that got the vaccine. And what they saw for the Pfizer vaccine is there was a 90% decrease in the risk of getting infected in the group that got the vaccine compared to the group that got the placebo. And as I said earlier, that is almost unprecedented. I mean, this wasn't a single, a double, or a triple. This was a home run for Pfizer's vaccine. This is more than anyone could have dreamed of.
Grand slam, absolutely.
Grand slam.
Okay, and so basically from now until whenever, let's say, we just bunker down, wear our masks, wash our hands, and be careful. Don't be scared. There's being scared, and then there's being cautious.
Right.
And then just for the sake of my own privilege, how does Holy Week look?
So I think Holy Week, barring any changes at the state level in terms of, them changing the capacity issues, I think Holy Week is going to look much like Sunday service looks. I think you're going to have to limit the number of folks actually in the church, but I think you will be able to have folks in the church. I think we're going to do, for the most part, the majority of us are going to be doing a distanced Holy Week, just like this past year. I'm just giving you my own read on it, because we won't have deployed the vaccines broadly enough by the time Holy Week rolls around to feel like we have herd immunity, to be able to get out and about. But I can say with fair certainty that Holy Week 2022 is going to look like very much what our Holy Weeks look like in a normal year. You may not be allowed to have standing room, folks crowding into the church in 2022, but you'll be able to fill, I would imagine, every seat, depending on how willing people are to get vaccinated. We can't control people rolling up their sleeve. Vaccines are going to be strongly encouraged, but I don't think the country is going to require you to get a vaccine or be put in jail or not be allowed to travel out of your home or be put on house arrest. And so we live in a free society. People are going to have to think about others, think about themselves, think about returning to normalcy, and be willing to get vaccinated. And that's what's going to get us out of this. I think Holy Week 2021 is going to be better than Holy Week 2020. And I think Holy Week 2022 is going to look much more like what we're used to in terms of Holy Week. I think I can be safe in making those predictions.
Okay, so some of you are not familiar with typing a question in the chat. Any questions, just kind of raise your hand and stick your hand on the screen, or some of you have to have other questions. I hope this helped. I mean, I'm sure, I know it helped. Or unmute yourself and ask your question.
This is Deacon Peter Belucas from New Jersey.
Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Deacon
Yes,
Peter?
yes. I'm also a chiropractor. I got some knowledge of what I just tuned in about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago. Now, the one question I have is, the people that have the placebo, are they exposed to the virus just like the ones that have that?
So let me give a more nuanced answer to that than I gave before. So no one got exposed to the virus on purpose in these trials. There are some trials going on in Europe around therapeutics and around some other strategies where volunteers are actually volunteering to be exposed to the virus. That's not the case for these vaccine trials. Folks just went out and about and did their usual daily activities, and they either got exposed or they didn't, which is why the number of folks they make the determination on efficacy is so much lower than the number of folks on the trial, because they just, randomly would catch the virus because the virus is out and about. Another part of your question might be, though, for those that got the placebo, what happens to those folks now? And those folks, once the efficacy data came out, will be informed they got the placebo. And then once the safety data shows that this is safe, they will also be among the first in line to get vaccinated, because since they volunteered, they stepped up to take whatever risk there was in an unknown, they're going to be allowed to what's called cross over and get the actual vaccination. And there's plenty of vaccine that's been set aside to do that. as a part of the trial. Not the stockpiled vaccines that are ready to go to the general population, but the trial itself has the vaccines ready to give to the placebo group because they participated in the study.
Oh, thank you. Um, Today's Bergen, the local newspaper here in Bergen County, New Jersey, The Record, has an article about one of the people that has been a volunteer here. And if you just go online and go northjerseynews.com, you can read the article. She talks about how she's been experiencing the trial. So I don't know if you're familiar. Are you familiar?
Yeah,
with that?
I'm not familiar with that article, but I am familiar about another gentleman who was on the Moderna trial, who's given an interview about the 2 injections that he got. And he described it with the first injection, he got a little bit of injection site pain. He got a fever and some body aches that lasted about 24 hours. He took some Advil, and within about 36 hours, he said he was feeling fine again, back to work, nothing limited his ability to move around, et cetera. It just was unpleasant. And then the second injection he said he got a little bit of pain, maybe some body aches, but it didn't even last 24 hours. It was much less than what he had gotten the first time. So I think what we're hearing, I don't know, maybe you can, Deacon, tell us a little bit about the person in the Bergen Record, if it was any different than that, but that's what I've seen from folks that have been interviewed.
She said that the second injection caused those symptoms that you described. She had, a fever and things like that. The first time around, it didn't bother her, supposedly. It's a good article. I just read it about an hour and a half ago. And she did what you described, but muscle ache and so forth. So that's, if you get a chance, read the article. Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else, just unmute yourself or type some. It has been reported that vaccines will require very low temperatures for storage and distribution. Do you believe that this will hinder the delivery of the vaccine?
Not to you and I. We are fortunate that we live in a industrialized society where -80 freezers are readily available at every hospital, at many clinics and facilities. And so the ability to keep the vaccines cool, this is true of both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, we benefit from in this country. What I meant when I said that I think slow and steady, Johnson & Johnson will ultimately win the race, is their vaccine does not have to be kept at -80. And I think their vaccine is going to be much more widely distributed worldwide, because third world countries where keeping a vaccine refrigerated to -80 is, if not impossible, a major challenge. The J&J vaccine is going to address that because it doesn't have to be stored under those conditions. But I think for all of us on this Zoom call and just about everybody we know that lives in the US, we have the capabilities to keep those vaccines stored safely in order to administer them.
I have a question for Father, but also for you, Doctor, and I appreciate your help on this. When you do the liturgy, are you wearing a mask during the liturgy?
Well, during the liturgy, no, I do not wear a mask. But when I give communion, I wear a mask.
Okay.
And I should be wearing a mask when I am speaking to the congregation facing them.
Okay.
And, honestly, I just forget. I just got to remember to do it.
Yeah. The other question is this. The reason why I asked that question, because there you're standing in front of the altar table, and there's the chalice opened. And there you're speaking, and then the doctor about the droplets might be coming out. We don't know whether it's, that's where I'm concerned. Doctor, what do you think?
So I think since we are taking, and this is Father Elias's initiative, taking major precautions with respect to being able to conduct communion by using individualized spoons for each parishioner. And as Father Elias says, he wears a mask when he's giving communion. I think just like with the andiro, that folks are masked and gloved when they're preparing it, wearing a mask while over any anything open that may come in contact with the instruments that you're using for each of the folks, those spoons, would be another precaution that can be put in place. Again, I defer to Father with respect to, and to you, quite frankly, with respect to the religious implications of that. But I can say as a physician, an infectious disease file, I'm not an infectious disease doc. I do have a background in immunology, which is why I've been tasked with being involved in the pandemic response at my institution. But I've gotten an amazing education on infectious disease over the last 9 months. I would say the more we can do to make folks feel comfortable, the more we can do to lower risk of transmission without violating important principles of our faith, I think the better. And I can say that certainly our church, and I can probably say the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese more broadly, has been very responsible with respect to this pandemic. I don't know that that has been the case with all denominations of faith across the country in terms of how they've approached it. But anything that will reduce droplets becoming airborne and potentially landing on surfaces is going to increase safety.
Okay, because since I'm a deacon over here, the Archbishop Epidopoulos was here in Tenafly. I don't belong to that archdiocese. I belong to the Antiochian Archdiocese, but I had heard that Epidopoulos was at St. John's 2 weeks ago, and when he saw that the congregation was not receiving communion, he sent his deacon out to the car to bring in the 100 spoons, and that's where they were used individually. And then Father Angelo went ahead and sterilized the spoons. So that was also the actors I wear a special mask that has a nose that sticks out because that allows me to breathe easier, and that way it's a big mask. It's a mask that for actors that they use for, that's what they think that we're going to be using in it that way, because wearing what the mask that everybody's wearing, it's very difficult, and especially when you're singing or something like that. You're able to sing, and it's it's better. It looks like I have a big schnoz.
So is there actually something that covers your nose?
Nose and mouth. It's a regular mask, but it protrudes out. It has a wire mesh in there to keep it out so it won't collapse. So
understood.
And
so it's still covered. The wire mesh is covered by the material, but
yes,
it keeps it off your nose.
It keeps that way I can breathe easier. And because my sinus sometimes clogs up and I have a hard time and I have to open it and so forth. So I found that mask very helpful. It looks weird. If you go, if you check, St. Anthony's Orthodox Church in Bergenfield, and you watch out, you'll see us when Alpsaltis wear it, and so it makes it much easier for the chanting.
Hey, who cares how it looks as long as it works? If you're wearing a mask while you're chanting and it covers your nose, but you're able to keep it off your nose, but the material is still preventing those droplets and particles, sounds like a brilliant solution.
Yes, I think these were because the people on Broadway that are involved in that theater group. So I'm something to look into even for the priests, even to wear, because I'm concerned, like I had asked the question earlier about the droplets coming, and there's the chalice sitting open, unless he puts a cover right on top of the chalice that the droplets won't come out of his mouth.
Got it.
Something.
I cover the chalice with a cover pretty much most of the liturgy, and the lamb itself, the body is exposed, but I'm pretty far away from it. I know it's not that, I don't know. I mean, it's a question amongst the clergy, brother deacon, that
yes, I know it is
about communicating that kind of fear or whatnot. So I'll be happy to have the conversation with you.
Okay. That's it. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Libutti, sorry, Father Elias, it's Melina.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I have a two-part question. So if you have kids that are teenagers or in college and they're in a few years, it could be childbearing years, with the vaccine, I mean, 6 months isn't really that long a time to really know potentially if there are some negative side effects. And some colleges and schools might require it. What are your thoughts? I mean, I don't really want my kids to get the vaccine. I would get it, my parents, but I'm concerned that what if there's an unknown that could impact them in a year or 2 or 5?
So it's a great question. So and I'm gonna break it into 2 parts, because there's the vaccines we have a lot of experience with, and now there's mRNA-based vaccines, which I said earlier was a new technology. So let's first start with vaccines that we know about, have had for years. There is no evidence, and never has been any evidence, that getting vaccinated will either impact your ability to reproduce, so childbearing years, or have any ill effects on your children if they become vaccinated. A lot of this fear about vaccines and autism and things like that has never been supported, not by a shred of evidence, that there's a danger in those vaccines causing any sort of developmental problems. So that's the vaccines we've had available to us to this point. There's nothing about an mRNA vaccine that would make that any different. And I've been working with recombinant materials and gene therapy, quite frankly. That's one of the areas that's my principal focus for the better part of 30 years. And the way in which these vaccines work to stimulate an immune response should have no reason to cause any sort of developmental problems. But you raise a good point. We don't have the experience with those vaccines yet. We'll have 6-month data on these vaccines by around March, April timeframe, because patients started getting vaccinated over the summer for these trials. And then obviously, as time goes on, we're going to have more and more data on these vaccines. I have, all my children are 18 or older, but I have a niece and a nephew who are 15, both with asthma. The boy, they're twins, both the boy a little worse than the girl. And as soon as there's a vaccine available for folks under the age of 18, I'm going to advise my sister to get them vaccinated. And I love them dearly. They're my sister's children. And so I would advise, we don't have any grandchildren yet, but we have grand niece and nephew, Mary's sister's daughter, Alexis, and her husband, father, John now. Many of you know he's a chanter, and he's beautiful voice. He's come to the church often. As soon as the vaccine has been shown to be safe for children, I'm going to advise Alexis to get her children vaccinated. And so I am not concerned. I know each person has to make their own decision. I will wait, obviously, for safety data in children to become available, but I have no fears about vaccines causing any sort of developmental issues, because I've just, as a scientist, never seen one shred of evidence to support that position in all the years we've had vaccines available across the world.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
Yep, my pleasure.
I would say last question, because we don't want to take up too much of the doctor's time, but it's written there. It's from Antonia. Is the messenger RNA technology being applied for vaccine development of other major illnesses?
Yeah, it sure will now. I mean, you can bet on it. The fact that a 90% effective vaccine was developed for coronavirus, where no vaccines had ever been successful in developed for coronavirus, you will see mRNA technology used for the flu vaccine, used for just about any viral vaccine. And I guarantee you there are labs right now looking to see whether they can develop an HIV vaccine using what we've learned from these technologies for coronavirus. So it's a great question, because as with every other major health crisis we've had to deal with as humans, throughout our entire history, what we learned for the treatment of that particular disease has always been another brick in the wall of understanding how to fight disease in general and other diseases. And we've learned so much so far from SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 that it's going to aid us in treating a whole host of other viral illnesses and being better and more facile at developing vaccines. So there's been a big downside clearly to this. Over 1 million people have died worldwide, 220,000 and climbing in the United States. We've had to distance ourselves from each other. We're going through these trials and tribulations. But what we've learned through all of our prayers, the miracle of these discoveries that we've made are going to make us that much stronger and that much more capable of fighting the next challenge that we'll be faced with. And so when we come out of this tunnel, and the light is at the end of the tunnel now, we will be better off for it.
Do you think pharma may now start implementing simultaneous trials, although at higher cost, to accelerate vaccine development approval?
Yeah, I think they will. And I think it's important that government be involved in helping to subsidize this. You know that these vaccines are going to be free. Nobody's going to be charged for vaccination because it's all been subsidized by the government. And the Eli Lilly antibody therapy is being subsidized by the government. So those treatments are going to be free. And so I think an industry embraced this concept. They shared information between the various companies. They work hand in glove with the government. So I think this has ushered in a new era of cooperation. I can tell you in New Jersey, the cancer programs, although we collaborate, are competitive, competitive for patients, et cetera. Beginning with this pandemic, I started a Friday morning phone call of every cancer center in New Jersey. We get on the phone with each other right now. It's every other Friday, sharing information on how we're dealing with the pandemic, on clinical trials related to cancer, on ways we're treating cancer. We've talked about ways we can shift patients to each of our other locations if we run into a big surge like we saw in March and April. So the era of cooperation that this pandemic has ushered in is unprecedented in terms of folks working together to try to beat it. I hope that lasts into the future. Father, nice look.
I'm trying. Anyone want to donate K95 masks to the church? Please feel free to do so. We also want to congratulate Miss Libutti, Mrs. Libutti, and Mr. Libutti. 30 years married this week. 30 years married. Glorious marriage.
Yep.
And everyone.
Lucky guy.
Yep, you're blessed. We don't believe in
I'm
luck.
blessed.
Blessed. There
I'm
you go.
blessed.
Good boy. Good boy. Otherwise, anything else last minute? It's been about 90, 100 minutes so far. So I think we should end it here and continue to pray, continue to be vigilant, responsible, humble, right? Wear the mask, be humble, social distance, and pray for me and pray for the church, pray for the world, especially those people who are in third world countries and areas of war and natural disaster, not able to have these privileges that we have here. So that's it, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, my privilege. My pleasure.
Thank you all for signing on. My email is in the chat. This is being recorded. Thanks to Mary Libutti reminding me. And that link can be sent out. It will be sent out to the parish. And that's it. That's it, everyone. God bless you and keep you all in good health and protect you.